So Lowkey is a British Iraqi hip-hop artist, political campaigner. He is a patron of the Stop the War Coalition, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the Peace and Justice Project founded by 𝗦𝗂𝘂𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝘄𝗓. He has a Master's in Middle Eastern Studies from the SOAS University and is an advisor to the website 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝗗𝘁, which investigates the activities of the British intelligence services and the Ministry of Defence. And I know many of you know him in particular, not just for his wonderful hip-hop, but for his work on Palestine. So give him a very warm...
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. So I think for us to discuss this in an effective way, we need to establish two things. Number one, we need to establish what does Irish neutrality actually look like in a material way. And number two, what is behind the forces within Ireland pushing it towards NATO. So to start with, while Ireland may enjoy what is referred to as military neutrality, it has funneled 134 million euros in non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine, which has included fuel and protective gear. We also know that the Irish government have authorised 30 members of the Irish Defence Forces to give specialised training to Ukrainian soldiers as part of a European Union mission. We also know that Irish officials are part of the meetings of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which was set up by the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin to coordinate military aid to Ukraine. Now, Lloyd Austin, before he was US Defence Secretary, was actually the director of the arms company Raytheon, which it has increased the value of its shares throughout the war in Ukraine by 17%. And actually that brings us to the crux of this issue, because Ireland has the lowest defence spending of any EU member as of 2021. At that point, it was just 0.2% of GDP. On average, across the EU, you have about 1.3% of GDP being spent on defence spending. And that's what this push, which we are currently in the midst of, and what this meeting is about pushing back, is about. It's increasing the allocation of your money towards the making of weapons and towards the military. And as I'm sure you will know, across the last few days, the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy is being held in Cork, Galway, and Dublin. Now, of course, the Irish government are claiming that this has nothing to do with NATO. It's not about us joining NATO. Of course it's not. No. So I took it upon myself to not only force myself to watch some of the festivities of this discussion, but also examine some of the panelists who were speaking there. So to start with, we have a panelist by the name of Renata Dewan, who is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. Now let's think, who funds Chatham House? Well, Chatham House is funded by the UK Foreign Office, by the US State Department, by BP, by ExxonMobil, which actually made $56 billion in the first year of the war in Ukraine. Also, Chatham House is funded by the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's funded by Shell, which made $40 billion from, of course, the change in the oil market. It's also funded by the British Army, BAE Systems, Boeing, the US Embassy, Lockheed Martin, who increased the value of their shares by 37% in the first 6 months of the war in Ukraine alone, NATO, Israel lobbyist 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁, the Israeli Embassy, and believe it or not, the fucking Guardian newspaper. That's who funds Chatham House. So other attendees of this esteemed consultative forum on international security policy, this is the adults in the room conversation. Who else did they have speaking there? Oh, a gentleman by the name of Neil Melvin, who just happens to have a key position at Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, key think tank. Who do we think funds RUSI? Well, it's only Raytheon, BAE Systems, and the world's largest arms manufacturer, Lockheed Martin. Who else spoke at this veritable party of warmongers? A lady by the name of 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘆, who is on the board of trustees. She's on the board of the trustees for the 𝗏𝗏𝘂𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁 School in Berlin. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with NATO, right? Well, just several months ago, the 𝗏𝗏𝘂𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁 School in Berlin hosted NATO's Allied Command Transformation Unit, which conducted a NATO model event at the school, where young people were being trained to become functionaries of NATO. And then we come to who has chaired this wonderful conference, the Dame Louise Richardson, who is a chair in global security based at the Blavatnik School at Oxford University. So the very school that she works for at Oxford University is funded by Sir Leonard Blavatnik. He is estimated by some to be the richest person in England, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he purchased former state assets and privatized them. He also funds the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and he is a close friend of several key Israeli figures, and he just happens to be a Ukrainian billionaire oligarch. So, is Ireland neutral? Well, I don't need to tell any of you about Shannon Airport, and it has been used for US military operations in Iraq and the NATO war in Afghanistan. But it's not alone in being a civilian site, particularly for aviation, which is used by the US military. Of course, during the Cold War, Air America, as a company, was established by CIA agent George Deuel, and Newsweek even referred to it in the following way: in practical terms, Air America is an operating arm of the CIA. And today, with my flight into Dublin, I saw many people getting off Air America flights. You also have Southern Air Transport, Continental Airlines, Northwest Airlines, Air Ethiopia, and even Air Jordan were proxies for the CIA throughout the Cold War. May sound crazy, but it's true. You can look it up. Now, when we think about what NATO actually has done in a material way, I feel that when we watch the mainstream media, certainly in England and I'm sure in the United States, you get this sort of vague notion that NATO is some sort of united colours of Benetton, save the world, children's charity almost. NATO's war in Afghanistan produced 5.3 million refugees. That was a quarter of the Afghan population. It left 72% of the Afghan population in poverty and rendered Afghans statistically the saddest people in the world. We know that after NATO's humiliating exit from Afghanistan, the US government spitefully decided to freeze $9.5 billion worth of assets in the Afghan central bank. That would lead to 97% poverty rate in the last year or so. Before the US invasion, we know that opium production in Afghanistan was almost zero. Following the occupation, over 90% of the world's heroin came from Afghanistan. And funnily enough, the Helmand province was the center of opium production during the NATO occupation. And it just so happened that the British military had 10,000 soldiers on 140 bases in the Helmand province at the same time. What else is the NATO legacy in Afghanistan? Well, a company by the name of 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘆. Many of us, the interesting thing about the way the US is able to outsource what it does is it obscures some of its most ugly and heinous crimes in the anonymity of obscurely named vague companies like 𝗏𝗀𝗁𝗁. It was one of them. It was a security company which actually enjoyed on its parent board at Veritas the Secretary of State in the Bush administration, Richard Armitage. Well, 𝗏𝗀𝗁𝗁 was revealed by WikiLeaks to have had workers in Kabul hiring child sex slaves from among the Afghan population. What about Armour Group, the US security company tasked with guarding the US embassy during the NATO occupation? Its employees were found to have violated the Trafficking Victims Protection Act by visiting brothels in Kabul. And eventually all that happened was the parent company, G4S, paid a fine to the US government and nothing was done, and that was forgotten. Of course, we've just crossed the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, which 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations globally protested against. The occupation in Iraq displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and killed over 1 million people. Since then, the US has spent $32 million per hour on war. The war on terror entailed the US dropping on average 46 bombs per day for 20 years and displacing 37 million people. As an Iraqi, I am proud to be from a civilization that kicked the arse of the British occupation and kicked the arse of the US occupation. And the majority of humanity, have far more in common with Iraqis and Irish who kicked the arse of their occupier and their colonizer than they do with the colonizers in smart suits who speak in the language of officialdom. Rage against them. Thank you.